when I went into military, I was already mentally prepared to just not play for 2 years because you could get it was really dependent on what kind of job I would get in the military. So fortunately for me, I got one that allowed me to like go home every day. It was like a 8 to 5 job. So I could still kind of play part time, I guess, but not really. I would say it's like the same as schooling actually, because like, it's roughly the same hours. So I was fortunate enough to have that. So after like the basic military training, right? That takes about 2 months. After that, I would go into my actual vocation. So when my vocation started was when I said, "Hey, I can come back to play part time if you guys want."
All right, I am here for In Retrospect with Benkai, who is a Singaporean CSGO player, someone that a lot of you probably know. He was very, very renowned back in the day in, the Dreamscape days, even the B.O.O.T days. I would say was probably the peak of your career, Benkai. And now you're obviously playing for PaperX, so we'll see how that goes. Probably more so in 2021 rather than what's happened so far this year.
Mm-hmm.
I think people would generally consider you one of the better players from the Southeast Asia region, but you're not someone that's done a whole lot of interviews in the past. So my first question is, why is that? Like, I wondered why you haven't really been out there in the media presence so much.
I think because it's like a running joke with Nick from CS:GO to Asia. Like he always made a comment on how he's interviewed everyone on boot except me. So I just wanted to keep it that way as like a running joke. So it's more like a joke rather than a preference not to do interviews.
So it's
But
more about him than you.
yeah. So but I mean he's really got his interview when I joined because I'm actually legally obliged to do so now, so I can't say no anymore.
I did see that, and that was part of the reason why I was like, oh, Benkai does interviews. I guess I might try and get one with him. Anyway, so we'll see how this goes. We obviously want to go through your whole career starting at the beginning. And there's quite a few interesting things in there. You obviously watched the one I had with Impression and sort of reached out and said that maybe you wanted to clarify a few things. So for anyone that saw that, that'll be later on. Maybe even in the second half of this video, because obviously it's split into two. So if you're watching now, you can have a look at the descriptions and there'll be links to whatever timestamps there are. But it may be in the second half of the interview, which will be released a little bit later. Anyway, let's get jumping into all of this discussion, right? Because first I want to sort of just get an understanding of how you started off in Counter-Strike and just esports or gaming in general. So when I first was researching this, I looked at what you had played for, what teams you'd played for. And on Liquidpedia, the first team that you were, it said that you'd played for was Insidious Gaming. But you sort of mentioned to me that that was actually Team Dreamscape. And you'd been on Team Dreamscape prior. So that would have been like around 2014, 2015 kind of time, or did you start a little bit earlier than that?
I started like really late 2013. So that's roughly when I joined Dreamscape. And afterwards we got picked up by this Singaporean org called Insidious Gaming. So I think before that we didn't register as Dreamscape because I don't think we had any HLTV matches under that name. So that's why Insidious was the first one to be recorded. Yes.
Yeah, so basically, once you joined Insidious, that's when all of these recorded results started to come through. And the Insidious roster was Splashgy, Dejavu, X, Dom, ZHSL, and you. So it's definitely a very different looking Team Dreamscape from the one that ended up going into B.O.O.T. There wasn't too many results really of note, I don't think, with that Insidious Gaming roster. The one that I probably wanted to talk about was IEM Taipei, the SCA qualifier. I think that might have even been the last event that you had with Insidious Gaming. And I always like to talk about the last event that you have with any roster because it's always interesting to know, like, did you know at the time that you were going to be making those roster changes or leaving that roster or, doing whatever? So what was the whole situation for you? I mean, did you sort of know at this IEM Taipei qualifier that you were going to be making a big roster change? Because when you actually moved back into that Dreamscape name, that was when there was that big sort of roster shuffle kind of thing.
Yeah. If I remember, we didn't know prior to the event. We only knew like after we finished it because after all these like qualifiers for these big events came out, right? We started recognizing that this could lead into an actual career in the future. So at that point, only me, Splashkey, and Dejavu could afford to go down that path. The other two were like quite in maybe their mid-20s really. So maybe they wouldn't have as much time as we do. But Dejavu was bound for like military service already. Yeah. So then me and Splashkey decided that we were gonna take this more seriously. So we slowly made roster moves to try and cater to like our vision that we had. Yeah.
It's interesting that you mentioned military service because that's obviously something that's impacted your career as well, and we'll get into that at one point. But yeah, obviously yourself and Benkai went on to do some pretty crazy things with that B.O.O.T roster. So I guess let's just jump into that whole discussion then about how this Dreamscape roster sort of returns. It was obviously one of the best, or probably the best team from Singapore in Counter-Strike Global Offensive. I think that really isn't worth much of a discussion. I think everyone would probably agree with that. Even probably one of the best, if not, again, one of the best or the best Southeast Asia teams from Counter-Strike. Even, I would argue, at one point in time, it was the best Asian team in Counter-Strike, although for a very, very short period, only a few months. So what was that roster when it initially was formed, Team Dreamscape? It was obviously yourself and Splashkey, but then there was, Impression? I think it was Lumberjack, and who was the other one? Moxie, maybe? No, it wasn't Moxie.
Reedy?
Reedy,
this guy called Josh.
Yeah. It was Reedy, yeah.
Yeah. So basically, we just handpicked a bunch of guys that we thought were good enough and were smart enough to be in the team. So Josh was, I think we picked him up as like a second opper. Lumberjack, I'm not sure how. I kind of forgot how we got Lumberjack, but I know we just knew him from playing casually. Yeah. But we later found out he's a doctor, so that didn't really turn out very well.
That did definitely affect his career later on in the piece when you guys eventually joined B.O.O.T was kind of when he departed the team. But I think around this time was when Splashkey was like, how old would he have been? Like maybe 15 or 16 or something at the start of B.O.O.T Dreamscape? Or at the start of Dreamscape, I should say.
At the start of Dreamscape itself, I think he was 14.
Jesus. So wait, how old were you at the time, and what was that like then playing with a 14-year-old on your team? Because to me, I feel like that would just be a whole can of worms that I wouldn't really want to get into, you know?
I think I was 17 or 16. I feel like 16, yeah. But I think it was okay because me and like Splashkey had like similar mindsets in a way that we haven't really like matured yet. Yeah, so I didn't really have any like problems with him or anything.
I guess when you're 16, it's not that much of a jump from when you're 14. But
yeah,
definitely, like, any alarm bells would be ringing to me, especially with a 14-year-old, but even with a 16-year-old on a team, it's just like, oh, how's this going to go? Anyway, it turned out pretty good. So we'll jump into one of the first tournaments that I sort of wanted to talk about here with this roster. It was the DreamHack Masters Malmo 2016 qualifier. I don't know if you remember all these events, but it's in the document. You can click on the links and stuff, and if that helps. So you went to this tournament, and I think this was the one where you got seated right next to Tai Lu. So you played Tai Lu first tournament with the Dreamscape roster, get a 2-0, wrecked out of these qualifiers. So it's obviously not off to a good start. But what's the general vibe in the roster at the time? Like, are you guys feeling pretty happy with how the team's sort of been put together? Are you expecting to be, inevitably one of the best teams in SCA?
We were definitely working towards that, but we knew that. I mean, we kind of knew that we would lose. I think because like we are hopeful and confident, but at the same time we're also quite realistic. As in, like, we've only put together the team for a few months, and Tai Lu have been around for quite some time already. So it's like, if we lose and we lose, it wouldn't be such a big deal for us. So we were just like, fuck it, let's just play it and just try our best.
It's a good experience as well, I guess. How many times you'd faced Tai Lu prior to then probably wouldn't be that many compared to, how often we see them nowadays. But I feel like that might have been a bit of a jump in your career in terms of level of tournament that you were playing in, or am I wrong?
I think, that was like I feel like that was one of the first events where we fought teams from the Asia region. I think we've already fought teams from like within Southeast Asia, but not like to that extent of like China, Mongolia, and all those teams. Yeah, so that's a new experience for us also.
All right. Let's jump forward a little bit in time then as well to Extremesland 2016. Now, this is in September, so it's been a little while, probably 8 or 9 months since you actually made this B.O.O.T roster, or again, I should say Team Dreamscape roster. And I think you actually do go into this event as one of the, not necessarily the favorites, but definitely a team that should be competing towards the top end, particularly given the fact that there's no Tai Lu at this tournament. Renegades was there, in fairness, so that was definitely a team that sort of slotted into that role of being the one that should probably win the tournament hands down. But how did you guys go about coming into this Extremesland roster? Because this is a LAN, and obviously it's a big tournament. I always feel like Extremeslands are a fairly important tournament within the Asia circuit because it sort of combines all of the Asia regions on LAN, which is not something that you get every day. So was this a big deal for you going to Extremesland in 2016?
I mean, we went in with the expectation of just getting to, I think, quarters. I think we were happy with just quarters because of maybe we just looked at how we were performing at the time, and we kind of gauged like what's the goal that we wanted to hit. And I mean, yeah, it would have been nice to win, but you had teams like I'm not sure if they were going under Vici or Flash.
Vici was there. It was like Vici Cybers and
yeah, that lineup with like Savage and
Savage TB.
those guys. Yeah, that team was pretty hard to beat at the time. So,
well, they actually ended up winning the tournament against Renegades as well. You guys lost to All Gamers, the other Chinese team.
Yeah, it seems like they like Renegades couldn't beat that Cyberzen lineup. I'm not sure why. Like it was like 2 years, right?
Mm-hmm.
That they lost to them.
I remember talking about this with Gomez in one of the geographically challenged episodes, and it was, I don't know, there was some sort of issue with the Renegades roster at the time when they went over to that tournament, and it all just sort of came to a head and they kind of blew up in that grand final, which I suppose isn't a surprise because theoretically they should have really won that tournament. Anyway, I think that's not too bad of a result for Dreamscape. And even still at this time, in 2016, I don't feel like Dreamscape was necessarily one of the big names. Mm-hmm. Within the Asia region. It was kind of a time still where the roster was kind of forming and you were locking in the right pieces of the puzzle. And speaking of that, we get to the point where Dejavu departs the roster and Moxie joins. So this is, to me, kind of the first big upgrade that you guys get. But what was your thoughts on getting Moxie into the roster? Because I've heard the discussions surrounding Moxie at the time were kind of like he was a real pain to deal with when he was playing against you guys. You know, he was a problematic player. So it was like, okay, well, let's just try and get him into the roster.
Yeah, I mean, so when Dejavu left, his playstyle was really like the very like lurky kind, and the kind that was really good for creating space for the team. So we knew that we've played against Moxie like so many times, so we kind of knew what kind of player he was, and his role and his playstyle was like the perfect fit for the gap that Dejavu left. So that's why we approached him to come in, because we knew that he's always been good. He's just like it's just like like you said, like a jigsaw puzzle in Singapore. We just had to like slowly find the pieces to put together.
How many players were there in Singapore at the time to kind of choose from? Because looking back at some of these qualifier events, there's like maybe 5 or 6 Singaporean teams playing in those qualifiers compared to now. Obviously, there's barely any. In fact, maybe you could argue there's 0 dedicated Singaporean rosters that are qualifying to the top end of things. So was he like the standout, or was there a bunch of other players that you might have thought about at the time?
For us, I think he was the standout because he's been around for quite a while already. Like even before, I think he's been competing even before I started playing CS. Yeah, so, and Singaporean players in general are very like they have this really childish mindset that they're the kind of team that like when they choose to come together and they play like maybe 3-4 tournaments together, like qualifiers or whatever, if they like just crash out, they'll just be like, okay, let's forget this, I don't want to do this anymore, and they'll just disband and they'll split ways. So that's what happens with Singaporean teams a lot. So we just needed someone with like a more mature mindset to come in. Yeah.
Sort of reminds me of Australian Counter-Strike from probably 4 or 5 years ago now as well, where that used to happen a lot. There would be a roster shuffle almost every 3 to 4 months. Now it's a lot more secure and stable, but I guess it is sort of a sign of the times, even there as well in 2016, that those roster shuffles would happen a lot more because there was no real infrastructure, there was no salaries, there was no reason to stay if you weren't getting wins. And speaking of wins, it wasn't quite a win for you, but I feel like ROG Masters 2016 was a bit of a breakout tournament for Dreamscape. This is where you guys actually came second to the Mongols roster. So it's another big sort of, I say international, but what I mean is domestic Asian kind of a LAN tournament. It's your first time playing against ANZ teams, or at least from memory, I think it is for you guys, the first time playing against ANZ teams. And you come in actually this time as one of the more favored teams, right? There's obviously Mongols who are definitely looking like the top dogs. But then there's yourselves, there's Vici Gaming, and then there's like the two ANZ teams, maybe we don't really know how they're going to go. Leapfrog, the other Singaporean team, did pretty well in this tournament from memory as well. But how was your perception of coming into ROG Masters 2016? Because this was actually the first time I did an Asian CS event, if you remember. I was casting that. So it was kind of my first insight into what Dreamscape looked like, and I was quite happy to be seeing you guys performing as well as you did.
I think I feel like we could have done a lot better. But at the time, like, thinking back with the kind of players that we had, I guess like I shouldn't be too upset about that result, because I think during then the Mongols lineup had like they were mainly full time, so they could maybe commit more than us, and we were always like schooling. We were always like a part-time team, so like whatever result we got, I think we were really pretty happy with that. And I think the ANZ teams were pretty. I'm not sure what happened, but they lost. I know back then it was the Chiefs roster. I think
Chiefs and Avant, were the two teams.
Yeah.
Avant was in your group.
Yeah, and I know Chiefs lost to Leapfrog, and we won Avant, I think. Yeah, but that was just groups, so I'm not really sure. I expected them to do better actually.
I think I did as well, to be honest. Like, I sort of had this thing in my mind where the ANZ teams, the top ANZ teams, would be sort of almost top teams within the global Asia region sort of thing. Like, if they would go to an Asian tournament, they would be a top 4 team. But obviously that wasn't the case. And at that time, I think this Chiefs roster was probably the best team in ANZ. And they came second in their group. They didn't really make it past the quarterfinals. Got 2-0'd by Vici. I mean, it was relatively close, but it wasn't, super, super close. And speaking of Vici, you also beat them in the semi-finals. But I wanted to touch on that grand final against Mongols, because I discussed this with Impression. And from his perspective, it seemed like this was like one of the first events that you guys had played on a LAN, on a big stage, and there was some degree of nerves that got to the roster at the time. And having a look back at the stats, if you take a look at some of the Map 1 stats, everyone's going negative. You just got wrecked 16-4. It just seems like nothing's going right. So you got off to a bad start in this series. And his opinion was, if you would have started that map off, even if it would have been closer, the likes of what Mirage was 16-12 or Cobble 16-13, losses, by the way, if you would have at least got to double digits, you could have actually won that series. What was that like from your perspective? Do you think it is just a snowball effect, or would it have not mattered regardless of what happened on that first map?
I think it was a snowball effect, because it was our first like grand finals of like a relatively big LAN event. So I think there was like a degree of nerves that came into play. Like we knew that Mongols was pretty, at the time they were like considered one of the better teams in Asia, and we didn't really study them that much. And I mean, back then our understanding of CS is so much different from now. So I think back then we were just like more puggy than an actual team. Like we would just like make plays and we would just call it off of that. Yeah, so that's so I guess if we just practice in a different way, like if we practice the way that we do now, I'm quite confident that we could have won them easily, I think.
There's a lot of times in my career that I say, if only I was as good back then as I am now, I would have been the best caster in Counter-Strike at the time. But times change, everyone levels up, and you kind of got to go ride that wave. Now, one interesting thing that happened at this event was this is where I feel like the B.O.O.T acquisition kind of started, right? And I talked to Impression about this, and if you remember, actually, B.O.O.T had a roster there that was a Chinese team, and they kind of sucked, right? So it seemed like they saw these guys from Singapore and thought, oh, they came second, they don't have an org, maybe this is a good opportunity to pick a new team up. Did you have any kind of impact in any of the discussions with B.O.O.T at all at this event? Or how did you see that happening? Or how did you see that sort of unfolding? Were you just on the outside?
I was mainly on the outside for this. All I knew was that after the event, I knew that two Chinese guys from B.O.O.T approached our then coach Benny. So they just started doing like having discussions from then on. So I wasn't really involved in like the actual discussion of joining the org. I just knew that we were in contact with these guys called like from B.O.O.T. So
okay, so
yes.
they obviously had a bit of a discussion at ROG Masters 2016, but it wasn't until early 2017 where you did actually join B.O.O.T. And before that time is when Alecks came into the roster for the first time. He's been in and out of these rosters quite a lot, and he replaced Lumberjack. You mentioned that earlier. Lumberjack was a doctor, so this is a point where I think he sort of knew that you guys were making that next step, and he was like, okay, I'm gonna leave the roster and let you guys do what you need to do because I can't commit as much time as I would need to. But Alecks comes into the roster, so what was your opinion of Alecks at the time? Was he like this sick fucking fragger or whatever, or was he some washed up guy? What did you think of him?
No, I don't think he's washed up. We picked him up because we knew that he's been a long time teammate of Moxie, and we knew that he is like a pretty smart player. He has a good understanding of the game. So I think that's what we needed in the team at the time. Yeah, we just needed someone that could understand the game more than some of us in the team. Like it'll help us with like mid-round calls and stuff.
Was he supposed to come in as the IGL? Because if I remember correctly, I think you might have been IGLing at some points during this B.O.O.T roster, or even maybe back in the Dreamscape days. But there was like no dedicated caller in the team until Alecks kind of came in, and then at the point where Impression took over IGLing later on in the piece.
Ideally, yes. Like we needed to find an ideal, like a dedicated IGL, because maybe at the time like our mindset was, oh, we need to concentrate more on our game. So we had players like me, Anthony, like Splash Key. Like I felt like all of us needed to focus more on our game rather than just like have one guy thinking about how to call all the time. So you just got a guy that could do that dedicated. Yeah.
How did you see your role in the team at the time? And sort of obviously it changed and morphed as you sort of went through your career. But it always seemed to me like you were the star, or you were the highest impact kind of individual in the roster. So did you have that same feeling? Was there like even maybe a level of ego or anything like that? Or were you kind of the chill guy?
I think last time I was just given the freedom to make whatever play I wanted. Yeah, because I have this I'm not sure if it's luck or just like game sense, because I have a pretty good tell of when I can get behind people. Yeah, so I'm normally the guy that's just getting the good like flanks in and everything. Like I'll know like tendencies and rotations and patterns. So I'm pretty good at abusing that during the team at the time. So I guess I did keep that role for most of my time in B.O.O.T. So I think that's why I generally played pretty well, but I've now since changed to like a more support role, and I've passed that on to like my other teammates.
And we'll get into that discussion as well. Maybe the golden era of Benkai is gone and it's never coming back. We'll see. Paper X is an interesting beast, but that's for later on in the video. First, we need to talk about this B.O.O.T acquisition of Dreamscape. So obviously at the time, this must have been a big deal for you, right? Because this would have been the first salaried team that you played in. I don't know what your circumstances were, whether you were playing and sort of working, or playing and studying. I know you hadn't gone into military service just yet at that time. That's something that came a bit later. But were you sort of splitting your time between playing and working, or studying or something at this point?
Yeah, I think mostly for my entire career up until I finished my military service, I was always splitting it between studies, mainly studies and gaming at the same time. So it was never like a something I could fully commit to. Yeah, so uh I guess I found it okay. Like it was like quite promising to get a salary while I was studying because it's not really a very common thing for someone in Singapore to do. So I just saw it as a good opportunity for me.
But it wasn't like a huge amount of money, right? It wasn't really necessarily enough to live off.
Uh, I think it was more than enough for someone that's just studying, because
Okay.
you don't really need much when you're studying in Singapore. It's like mainly you just want to cover like your expenses for food and maybe some transport, and that's it.
Right. Would you have been still living at home then, like not paying rent or?
Yeah, yeah,
Okay, yeah. Then that makes life a bit easier, right?
yeah.
Now, obviously, we know the boot roster had some issues with the organization later on in the tenure, quite recently, even almost going back to like 2019. But what did you sort of get from boot at the time? Like, what was your opinion of the organization then? Did they seem legit? Did you feel like you were ever going to get fucked in the future by them, or was everything sweet?
Uh, Maybe when we signed with them, we thought they were okay, like pretty trustable. Like the boss seemed like a nice guy that was actually like passionate about um having a CS team because like he used to be a player himself. So I guess we thought that he could relate to us more
Hmm.
in terms of like what we want to do in life. So I mean, I wasn't really surprised like towards the end of our like tenure with Boot because like our results were pretty lackluster, and I mean I still think there were like better ways that the boss could have let us go, but
Definitely.
he pretty much just like slowly like ghosted us and just stopped paying us. And after that, like so in our contract there was like a 3 month period where if we don't get paid within 3 months, then we break the contract immediately. So that's basically what happened. Yeah.
Okay. Well, we'll get into that discussion maybe a bit more in depth when we catch up
Mm.
to 2019. The other thing I wanted to touch on with this Boot deal was DSN was involved with Boot at the time, right? So he sort of came part and parcel with the organization, and now you're still working with DSN, who's part of Paper Rex. So what was your opinion of him at the time? You know, was he like this legendary figure, or were you a fanboy? Did you not care? What was it like having this guy from Europe to sort of interact with and maybe teach you a bit about Counter Strike?
Uh, I actually didn't know that he was in boot at the time until like much later when I think we hopped on like a TeamSpeak server with him or something, and he just like introduced himself. But before that, I didn't really know who he was actually because I didn't start playing CS until like Global Offensive, so I
Right.
didn't play Source or 1.6. That's why I didn't know him. But I'm quite sure that the rest of my team knew because they used to play like 1.6 and stuff and 1.6 Source. So they knew him more than that. But for me, I had to like after I heard his name, I had to like do some research, like watch the montages. Oh, DSN, oh.
Right.
Yeah. So yeah, so I think up to now we still like maintain a pretty good relationship with him because he's still generally like a nice guy. Sometimes too nice, but
Okay.
yeah.
Maybe is that part of the problem for Paper X, not kicking some of the players that need to be kicked? I don't know. We'll talk about that. Anyways, you start off with Boot, and I feel like there's a bunch of tournaments that you go to that aren't really all that much worth talking about. There's not too many notable results. But early on in the tenure of Boot, how are you feeling about things in the team? I mean, is there any indication of the future success that you would have? Like, are you starting to feel, okay, now we've got this salary, we're maybe dedicating a bit more time to the game, we could be the best in Asia at some point?
Uh, I think definitely I thought that if we just like practice hard together, that we would become like the best team. But I don't know. I think back then we all just like so lazy, you know. Like we didn't really knew what we had, or like how urgent it was for us to, like, the need for us to get ahead of everyone else. Like if we did practice properly back then, I think we would be ahead of everyone else by so much by now. Like maybe on the same level as, like, the same level of consistency as like Tailu.
You guys are all very like young at that point. I think it's like the roster, for anyone that wants to clarify, is Impression, Splashy, Moxie, Alecks, and Benkai. And the only guy that is a bit older, I think, out of those 5 is Alecks, right? Or was Moxie a little bit older than the rest of you as well?
Moxie was a bit older. I wouldn't say that much. Like he's not that much older. But I know Alecks was the oldest among us. But he was still like young enough to play at the time.
Yeah. Well, at the time, he says. Bit of a shot.
At the time.
Anyways, speaking of which, by the way, we get to the point where Alecks is benched from the roster. Although he didn't really get benched from B.O.O.T. As I understand, he actually left the roster due to some personal circumstances. So what was your opinion on this? Because I know there's always been, maybe not with Alecks, but with other members of the roster that eventually left. There's always been some sort of clashes maybe when it comes to personal circumstances affecting the game. So what did you think of Alecks leaving the roster and it wasn't necessarily him getting kicked?
I mean, obviously it was a shame, but I guess it was okay. Like it worked out in the end because we ended up getting Tommy, which was it was actually quite last minute because it was when Alecks left. It was when Alecks left that we went to approach Tommy, and I mean I won't get into the reason why Alecks left, but I remember it was at the time where we decided to try out a gaming house. Yeah, so we rented an apartment in Singapore, and we basically were gonna live there for like a 6-month period. And I guess during at the time, Alecks couldn't commit to that because he had like other things in his life.
I mean,
Yeah, so
I don't really blame him.
understandable.
You know, I wouldn't want to live in a gaming house. I don't know what your experience was like in that gaming house, but God forbid living with a bunch of like maybe even less than 20-year-old gamers, because it just doesn't sound like a very good time to me.
For me, I thought it was okay because like other than playing CS, I mean, I'm a generally like pretty chill guy outside of the game. Yeah, but I was pretty ragey when I played CS last time.
I think maybe you were part of the problem, you know, because you would have been one of those younger guys, right? So you're like, oh yeah, it was fine. But then if you're Alecks there and you're like 25 and there's a bunch of essentially kids running around just like fucking shit up in your house, you're like, I can't deal with this. Whereas from your perspective, you're like, yeah, this is sweet, man. I get to hang out with my friends every day, blah, 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 whatever. Anyway, so you add Tommy to the roster, and that's someone that you're still playing with today. So obviously a player that I guess you believe in or felt was a good fit. And I think he's pretty decent. I mean, I don't know as far as him versus Alecks, whether that's an upgrade or a downgrade at the time, but it still looks like a really solid roster. So there is that. But there's one thing that I want to bring up with you that I haven't actually ever had confirmation on. And it's around this time. I don't know exactly when this happened, but I heard that at some point you were offered a position or asked maybe to join the Kings roster from Australia. If you remember, this was the team that went on to become Order. So it started off with like EMAG and Wizard and Liaz, and I can't remember. Hats, yeah, I think was the other one. And there was one more player. Anyway, it doesn't really matter. Sicko, that's right. Yeah. So was that true? Were you asked to join this roster at some point around June 2017?
Hey, who told you this?
I have my sources.
Yeah, so basically, I forgot what event it was after. It might have been one of the maybe I don't think it was Extremesland. I think it was that minor in Korea. There was one of the Asian minors that was held in like Korea. So I think it was after that period where I played pretty well against like I think Tainted Minds.
Yep.
During the time. So their then coach David, I think it's David. He approached me and asked like are you open to moving to Australia to play? Like, what's your plans in the future and stuff? Yeah, and at the time I was already kind of expecting to go into military service, and at the time I was still studying. So I mean, there was no way that I was gonna join. Like, there's no way that I could see it like actually working. Yeah, so I did get somewhat asked to join, but I mean, I just couldn't at the time.
So what, the military service would have meant that you just can't leave Singapore until it's over, or? And obviously your
Uh,
studies, I guess, is another factor, but
yeah. So I mean, yeah, you just couldn't leave like
right.
until you were done with like your military service.
Even if you
Yeah.
haven't joined yet, like, because I don't think you'd started it at that point, had you?
Yeah, no, but I'm at the point where I'm past the age where if I leave my studies, I would have to go in quite short. I'll
Yeah.
have to go into military service quite shortly after I leave my studies.
Okay.
So it was so there was no way that I could make it work.
In an ideal world, if you would have had the option to do it and it could have worked, would you have taken that? You know, would you have left Boot and joined Kings?
Mm, yeah, I think I would have.
Why?
Like, I feel like it would be like a good step for me in my career because I think during at that time it was safe to say that the teams from the ANZ region were like typically better than most of the teams in Asia. So I've been already playing like for Boot for quite a while. So I think it would have been a nice like breath of fresh air if I went.
How do you think you would have performed in ANZ? You know, like, do you think you would have been individually above a lot of the ANZ players? Because the idea behind that Kings team, by the way, was to be like a super team. It was to get like all the best talent that wasn't already like pretty much locked down and be the best team in ANZ. So you reckon you would have been the best team in ANZ, and where that might have gone from there, who knows?
Uh, I think when I was at that age, I think I would have kept up pretty well.
Mhm.
Yeah, if not better than most of the ANZ guys. So
What could have been? It's an interesting. It's a whole. You know, like I always think about that. I'm like, I wonder if Benkai would be on order now. You know, because that's like where that team went. There's obviously not very many players. I think there's not even any players left from the Kings roster that's currently on order. But you know, if you follow the history of that team, it's been from there. Anyways, I guess we'll put that to the wayside because that never actually ended up happening, and we'll keep going with the Boot discussion, which, to be fair, worked out pretty nicely. So let's get into some of the more happy times, right, for Boot, where you actually started to get some pretty good results on the board. You know, we talk about Dreamhack Masters Malmo 2016, where you matched against Tyloo and you kind of got wrecked. That was the first iteration of Dreamscape. Now we talk about Dreamhack Masters Malmo 2017 qualifiers, and again you faced Tyloo, but this time in the grand final, and you win the grand final. So this seems like really the first notable result that you had as the Boot roster, and you've also beat Tyloo, right? Which is a big deal. This is the Bentet Tyloo as well, so I don't know whether that's good, whether that's bad, but you've outplaced the likes of Tyloo, Mongols, Greyhound, Vici. There's a lot of big names there, and this seems to be kind of the rise of Boot. So what sort of happened at this point in time for Boot? Are you guys like finally starting to hit that peak level that you had been hoping to get to?
I think we were like during that qualifier, we were hitting our peaks because we were all in the gaming house. So I think that contributed to some of like how well we played because we are all together in the same room together, so we could do like fist bumps and stuff. But I don't think we had a good mindset playing that qualifier because we just like took it. We just told each other round by round, let's not worry too much about the opponents and stuff. So when the time came when it was Tyloo, and we just like played our best, and I think it worked out for us. But if I'm not wrong, I read somewhere in like some interview that Bentet said during that time the roster was having some issues in Tyloo, so they didn't really go in with maybe the right mentality. So that probably just gave us that like tiny edge that we needed over Tyloo to win. So it was just like it was like all the stars aligning for us.
Yeah, I do remember even a little bit later on where Tyloo was, it seemed like they were having a lot of issues and MVP had sort of fallen off as well. And that was kind of the period that I was talking about where I felt like B.O.O.T was probably the #1 team in Asia for a few months. That might have even been just before you went into military service or just after you went into military service. We'll keep going on the timeline and get there eventually. But this wasn't necessarily that time period that I was talking about. It's still a great sort of a result. You qualify for Dreamhack, obviously. So let's talk about Dreamhack, right? This was one of the first kind of international events that you would have played in, going against the EU and NA teams. And you kind of got your shit pushed in a way, right? You go 0-2. You got a grand total of 4 rounds against SK and C9 combined, by the way. So it was 16-2, 16-2 for both of those. So what was your first taste of international Counter-Strike like with this roster?
I mean, it really puts you into perspective after you just like get fisted that hard, about how ahead the other regions are compared to Asia in general. Like, there was so much ahead than everyone. So I think during the time I was calling, so after that event, it was kind of like a culture shock for all of us because it was our first big like international event. So I think we just went in and just tried our best. And I mean, our best was 4 rounds, so it wasn't that bad. 4 is better than 0, right?
That's true. It is. I guess there was a few interesting stats that I wanted to talk about from this tournament, and I sort of brought this up with Impression. Now he bottom fragged, so at least you kind of didn't take that wooden spoon prize. But first map you play against SK, Moxie's got 15 frags. He's doing okay. He's 15 and 16. No one else on the team's got more than 8 frags, so it seems like everyone's kind of just shitting the bed there. And then there's the second map as well, and actually you did bottom frag in this one. You got 3 frags. So what is it like being in the server against these teams that just are that far ahead of you? Is it just a case of like, you feel like you just can't even win an aim duel, or what's going on?
No, I think it was just we just felt like they always had the right reaction to what we were doing. Which I think what we did at the time wasn't really ideal CS because it was maybe just like calling, there's just a lot of like calling strats off the start and basically just pre-planning the round right before, like we just pre-planned the entire round. So we didn't really do any like mid rounds or rounds where we just like took things slow, we'll get control of this and then we'll move up. So we didn't really do any of that. So I think it was like we were insanely easy to read, and it's something that basically the European teams and the North American teams are so good at doing. It's like reading those really like basic play styles, you know.
What was the implication of these results on the team? Was there any like arguments in the team at the time, or was it kind of just like, well, whatever, you know, international team's too good, what can we do?
Yeah, I think it was something like we didn't really have that big of an expectation because it was like it still was our very first very big international events where we actually fought teams from other regions. So I mean, like I said before, like we are a pretty realistic team, so we weren't really that down when we lost to them. We're like, okay, we'll just use the rest of the time here to like maybe practice against these European teams and maybe bring some experience back. So that's just how we didn't really argue that much. I know after that I just stopped calling because I'm not sure. It was like forced upon me, I think, that yeah, because we didn't really do that well. Which in hindsight, I think I should have just continued calling because I needed that experience to grow. So yeah.
So what initially was your reaction to being asked to call? Because this very much lines up with the story that Impression told me, is that you were calling, but it wasn't necessarily maybe the ideal scenario for the team, right? Because you were, again, theoretically one of the better fraggers in that roster. So did it kind of impact you as an individual in the fragging department? Like you said, you sort of felt like you needed it to grow. So maybe long term it was good, but at the time, was it the right decision for you to be the caller in the team?
Mm, I think yes, because during it during that lineup, I think I was the one with the most understanding of like rotations and stuff, and I generally had a better understanding of the game. That's why I had that's why I could do the plays that I did back in boot, because I had a good understanding of when I could push and when I couldn't, and what I needed my teammates to do. So I basically just took my game sense and just turned it into like a calling style, which at the time was very unrefined, but I think it's a lot better now. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, you talked about bringing a bit of experience back to the region. So when you did come back, you played in the Zen League season 2. So if you remember, this was kind of like almost the prelude to ESL Pro League. There was no ESL Pro League Asia. There was obviously NA and EU. But this was kind of like, from ESL's perspective, a bit of a test run to see what an ESL Pro League might look like if it combined the Asian region and the ANZ region and all that. So what did you think of this Zen League tournament, right? This was one of the first kind of legit league tournament kind of things that we had in the Asia region that combined ANZ and Asia in a finals sort of position. But what did you hope maybe that this would become? Because from my perspective, I really hoped that this would be like a big deal kind of a tournament, right? This would be the prelude to ESL Pro League. Yes, we know now there isn't really an ESL Pro League anymore for Asia. But to me, this was sick.
Yeah. I agree. Like, we were pretty excited that someone was actually making the move to come into to combine both regions so that we could get more maybe exposure. Like, we could play against ANZ teams and vice versa. But mm, I think it's just a shame that it wasn't something continued, because sometimes when you're an Asian player and you just see teams like this, like Tyloo, like Invictus, Vici, you see them play against other Asian teams, and then you watch like a European game, and you're like, I think Tyloo could beat these guys easily. So it just kind of puts you in this mindset that if only we were not as geographically challenged, that we would have a very healthy like ecosystem within Counter Strike in general. If we had all the regions playing against each other.
Yeah, unfortunate that Zen never really blossomed into what it could have been. But to be fair, you guys actually didn't perform that well in Zen, right? You came back and you placed 5th. I think there was some roster issues at the time because Styron, I think it was Styron. Yeah, Styron was sort of stepping in. I can't remember who he replaced. It might have even been you for a few of these games. But there was certainly something going on for the boot roster during this time. So what was happening there?
I think I might have had exams during during study. So I might have took like maybe a few days off to focus on getting my work done, because I think the problem with our roster, right, was it was never anything cement. Like, it was never like a fixed 5 person that we could just work together and stick together for a long time. It was always like changing very frequently. So I think that's just one of the things that really stopped our growth as a team. Yeah, so we could never really reach the level that we wanted to.
Was it a bit of like a wake up call, or again, was it just one of those extenuating circumstances where you thought, well, what can we do, right? Because as you said, it's a bit of a rotating core.
Yeah, so after we realized that we really needed like a team that could commit, we just made like the decision to like really look at our roster and try to get it to be as full time as we could. Yeah, so that's when we slowly started making like the changes. We started thinking about which players we could take, how much time they have before they have to leave or something. So we started taking a lot of that into account.
Okay. That's something that actually comes to the head a little bit later on in the piece when we get to sort of 2018 is when a lot of roster changes happen. First, we want to talk about Extremesland 2017. I think the expectations for Boot going into this tournament were a little bit higher than what they had been previously for the Extremeslands, in that you're one of the favorites in a way. There was a lot of good teams there. There was obviously Flash. There was Vici there as well. There's Eclipse roster as well, who came second as another one of these Chinese teams that just sort of pops up and kind of wrecks people. Kings was there as well. You guys actually only ended up coming 5th to 8th. So I almost feel like that's a kind of a disappointing result in 2017 for this B.O.O.T roster. You had a rough bracket placement, but it was technically your own fault because you didn't win your group. So there is that. But you did play against Flash Gaming in the first round of the quarterfinals, which ended up going on to be the eventual winner of the tournament. So that is rough. But realistically speaking, I think, was it, from the same from your perspective, that this was a disappointing result, only getting 5th to 8th?
I think, yeah, of course we were disappointed. Like, as a team, you always want to do better, And at the time, I felt like we've been together long enough not to be in 5th to 8th. So we should have done better. But I mean, being placed against Flash for the first game, I agree it was rough, but it shouldn't be an excuse for a team, because when you go into an event, you already should have the mindset of you should be able to beat everyone there to win it. So even if we get placed against the eventual winners, we had to win them at some point, So it was either in the grand finals or in the very first game. We were gonna play them eventually if we wanted to win the entire tournament. Yeah.
Overall, I mean, bit rough for you. And I think where it gets worse, there's this bit of a dip in the form of B.O.O.T. You can already see it. They've not performed so well at Zen League Season 2, Extremesland 2017, 5th to 8th place again. And then you go to the Eleague Asia Minor, which you come last place in as well. So it's just a bad run of form toward the late stages of 2017 for B.O.O.T. And surely this is starting to cause some issues maybe internally. Like, are there any concerns that the roster's not performing to the level that you would have expected it to at this point?
Yeah, I think maybe at that point in time, everyone was really really having like those second thoughts, like is this the right roster? Am I doing something wrong? Should I leave and try and maybe find a new team? But I feel like that's exactly what we needed to break through in order to be better as a team. But maybe we just didn't have the benefit of hindsight back then. Yeah.
So when I talked to Impression about this topic, he sort of mentioned that there was a period of time where you guys were in this gaming house, and there was also a period of time where you weren't necessarily committing full time to the game. So it was like this cycle, right? During the middle stages of the year, going from like June to August, when no one had exams, was actually incidentally when you would see the results kind of pick up for B.O.O.T. And then going to the late year where the exams start to come through again, you see a dip in form. And this happens like in like 2017 and 2018 and then like in 2019 as well. So did you sort of pick up on that as well, or is that maybe just in his mind?
I guess you could say that was true to a certain extent, but I think if we just practice smarter, not practice more, but practice smarter, we would have been generally okay, because like either way, the lineup was always a part-time lineup.
Mm-hmm.
It was always going to be a part-time lineup. It wasn't full-time. So it was just more of like how we use the time that we have to practice that would translate into how well we could play. And I just think we didn't practice well enough to be playing to the level that we need to in those times, in those periods where we have like exams and stuff.
So it's a rough situation when you can't commit the time to the game. And it's kind of funny that like even in late 2017, where things have started to get a bit more legit, it's still not, the infrastructure isn't quite there to kind of support teams within the Asia region. Anyway, we'll jump into 2018, early on in 2018. This is a bit more of a fun tournament, but I kind of want to get your thoughts on it anyway. The WESG 2017 APAC finals. Now, this was a geographical kind of a tournament. So you were, I think, Team Singapore going into that one. There was obviously Team Korea. There was Team ANZ. I mean, they weren't called Team Singapore and what have you, but the implication is that that's what it was. You were called B.O.O.T. There was this weird mix, the ANZ roster, and this is why I wanted to bring it up, of Chiefs, Greyhound, and Order, which actually I think ended up winning that tournament, even against MVP. Let me have a quick look here. Yeah, they did win. So this is what ANZ players always hate, these kinds of tournaments, because it fucks our teams, right? Because our teams always have, 3 or 4 ANZ Australian players and then like 1 New Zealander. So anytime there's a tournament that's like, you must play with a national team, there's always like, oh, we have to take one player out of our roster and just bring a sub or whatever. So Order, which was the Australian team, was like 3 different teams combined into one. They somehow win this tournament. Whereas you guys are Team Singapore. You are actually your roster. And MVP is also actually their roster. It's just actually the Korean team. So is that like... How does that feel, right? Because you've essentially lost to a pug team, basically. Is that something that sort of weighed on your mind at all? Or did you sort of not really worry about what happened in this tournament?
I'm not sure if we played that ANZ lineup, but I vaguely remember playing against MVP at that event. So I don't think we were that mad about it.
Let me have a look here. So you weren't in the same group as Order. MVP was actually in that same group. And you didn't play against them either. Yeah, you didn't play them in the bracket stage. So they came from the other side of the bracket, but you lost to MVP. But yeah, what is your general opinion on like these geographical based tournaments? Do you like them? Because it seems to me, if you're a team that is comprised of just one nationality, like these are the perfect opportunity to farm some cash.
Yeah. I would agree also. I mean, that's not really like it isn't as competitive as other events because of like this like nationality thing. And it also comes with the problem of like if some other like team, like for example, if Australia rosters a team with handpicked players from like Order, Renegades, Chiefs, and they all went and they all like win the entire tournament. And yet they might get like the idea that like shit, we're actually pretty good as a 5 if you want to form a team together. And you could like make a giant like clusterfuck of this like different ideas in the region. Like it doesn't matter which region it's from, but it could like have the potential of changing players' mindset when they win with that roster.
Funnily enough, I think not in Counter-Strike, but I recall something similar happening in Overwatch in Australia, where if you're familiar with Overwatch and the World Cup ecosystem, it's essentially each region builds a team and like everyone trials for this team. And there's like a committee basically from the region that chooses players. And they're all from different teams. It doesn't necessarily have to be like you can take just one team if they're all from the same country. But generally what happens is you get like the stars from each respective team and put them together and make this like super team as Team Australia or Team Canada or Team USA or whatever. So what happened one season was like this Team Australia roster, basically while they were over there playing in the World Cup, just were like, yeah, we should make a team for next season. And they came back and just fucking left all of their teams and made a new team. And they were like the super team in Australia after that. So that's kind of what you're talking about, right?
Yeah, that's exactly what I thought would happen.
Funny that happens. Anyway, so look, let's jump forward a little bit here in 2018 to March. And this is what you were talking about a little bit before with all of these roster changes that you thought you might have to make. Now, Moxie Moxie leaves the roster, I should say, and he's replaced by Winter. So long term, what was kind of the idea behind this? Because it's actually one of the first players, if not maybe even the first player that wasn't a Singaporean that actually played in B.O.O.T. Obviously, he lived in Singapore. But what's it like having a Kazakhstani on your team?
I think it was really he was just like a nice presence to have around in the team. Because he's pretty like he's super chill and he's like a pretty funny guy. Yeah, and so we like to and he's also so skilled, man. Like his firepower is insane. We just needed it's maybe one of the things that we needed. But maybe with the addition of these kind of players, it always comes with like some form of communication problems. Like they struggle with translating from their language into English. So that was one of like the main problems that he faced. But I think overall he managed it pretty well. Like he was still like a pretty good player and he could like understand us perfectly. It was just maybe sometimes he just took a bit of extra time to get his words out. Yeah, but other than that, it was pretty a fun it was a fun time having him on the team. Like, we just make fun about him, like do like So on Mirage, he always says like he just ladder room.
Mhm.
He always says it in like such a funny way that we just laugh every time we like no matter what match.
Like because of his accent or something.
Yeah, so he'd be like one ladder room.
Right. Just slurs the
He just
word
says it
kind
so
of
quickly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we just like, and other times you just make fun of him, like how he's not how his parents stopped him from watching Borat.
I didn't actually ever watch Borat, by the way, so maybe you can make fun of me. But anyways,
No.
it is a bit different when you're from Kazakhstan versus when you're from Australia, where you're like, whatever, I don't give a shit. Okay, so I also wanted to touch on this asking questions roster. If you remember at the time, that's where Moxie was going. And from what I've heard, this was supposed to be a team that would like play overseas or like go to Europe or something. So what did you think of that as a concept? An Asian team going, and I think it was like Poland where maybe they were supposed to go and like play for a year or something like that. What was your, what did you hear about this roster at that time?
I don't think that wasn't the asking questions roster. It was from another guy called Volkan. Yeah, he basically wanted to form like his own vision of an Asian super team where he'll pick out players from the regions and he'll basically field them in China. It was somewhere in China. Yeah, the Poland one was asking questions. So this Volkan guy, he wanted to form a team and field them in China. So it was like it was gonna be like Moxie. I mean, I don't
so far.
I don't even know like who the other players was. But I knew it was like it was gonna be international. Like he was gonna pick like maybe 2 guys, like or 3 guys from the European region, and maybe 1 more Chinese dude, and field them in China. And I guess it didn't really work out because of how difficult it was to have this work logistically when you're not a Chinese national trying to start up something in China. It's really hard.
Yep.
Yeah, and funny thing, I was actually asked if I was interested to join this lineup, which I kindly declined because like army stuff. So
again, army stuff kind of comes back to bite you. But yeah, I did wonder on what your thoughts were like. Were you like, oh well, why? I mean, I assumed you didn't get asked, right? But you would have been like, why did I not get asked? Or did you feel like you deserved to be on like this? If there was an Asia super team, do you reckon you should have been in that roster?
No, I did get asked to join the roster.
No, I know. But like, do you believe that you deserved that opportunity at that time?
Really? At that time, I would say no, because it wasn't something that I could commit to. Like I just basically couldn't commit to anything until I was done with my military service. So yeah, I don't think I would have joined if they asked back then. Yeah, I wouldn't have said yes to any like international offers or any offers outside of Singapore until I was done with military.
I feel like did we skip over when you started military service? Because I was going to talk about that with you. And I made a note of it. When did you actually start? It was like October 2017 or something, right?
No, 5th October 2018.
2018. Yes. Oh, we're not quite there yet. Okay, so I thought we missed it, but not quite yet. So, all right. Well, speaking of 2018, the biggest event of 2018, at least maybe for you guys, although you did play in Cologne as well, was IEM Sydney, right? So this was a qualifier that, for some reason, had 3 slots for the Asian region, which is... It's not something that happens every day, but this is kind of a big deal, I think, for B.O.O.T in particular, because you were the team that placed 3rd in this qualifier. So if it didn't have that 3rd spot, you wouldn't have made it. But also because just in terms of mentality going into this one, you see Tyloo, MVP, Flash, and you think those are the 3 teams that are probably battling for a top 2 spot. And then there's B.O.O.T that's like maybe the 4th best team at the time. And like they're kind of a dark horse. If they have a good tournament, they could potentially make it. But if it's 2 slots, you probably don't back them. If it's 3, maybe they can make that happen. Turns out you do make it happen. You look really good. You've got Winter in the roster now. Seems like things are going well. Again, by the way, this is in the middle of the year, getting towards that time where there's no exams. Don't know whether or not that's correlation, causation, or if I'm just making something up in my mind. But was there an expectation from your side to qualify for IEM Sydney? at that point in time, or did you believe going into that you were a degree of an underdog? And, like I said, Tyloo, MVP, and Flash probably were a little bit ahead of you at the time.
I think as far as we were concerned, whatever team that Tyloo or Flash were playing, whatever tournament they were playing in, we would always be the underdog to them. Because I always thought that they were better than us. Because they are full time, so they always have that edge over us. But I felt like that lineup at the time was good enough to at least qualify for the third placing slot that we have, if not the second slot, because we were practicing pretty hard by then and things were looking pretty good, I would say. So we did have the expectation of qualifying, because when we looked at it and there were 3 slots, we were quite happy about it, because I don't think it's been done in international event before.
No.
But I still think like those 3 slots went to waste, because when we went over, we didn't really do like all of the. I don't think any of the Asian teams did pretty well at IEM Sydney.
No. I think Tyloo in 2018. I think Tyloo did okay. I think they made it to the semis actually. Let me have a look here quickly. But yeah, yourselves and MVP definitely didn't get a whole lot done. Yeah, Tyloo came 3rd, 4th. I remember that because they were on the other side of the bracket to Renegades. Because that would have been potentially like Renegades played against Mousesports, but if Renegades was on the same side of the bracket as Tyloo, it would have been a Renegades Tyloo semi-final, and one of the teams would have made it to the grand final, which didn't end up happening, unfortunately. But yeah, for you, you qualified through for this tournament. I actually said on the broadcast, I went back and looked at this one, and I said, this is the best looking boot that I've ever seen with Winter coming into the roster. So was that what it felt like at the time? Was this the best iteration of boot to that point?
Yeah, I think it was the most like stacked team that we had in any point of time. And I kind of agree with you, but at the same time, I feel like it might have been part of like the honeymoon period of when a new player joins and everyone's playing well. So maybe it was during that like perfect period where everyone was like slowly hitting close to their peaks, which helped us get over.
Well, you got over Flash Gaming, actually, which had been a huge thorn in your side. You sort of mentioned that you always felt like maybe you were a little bit weaker than them. I think they'd beaten you at the Eleague minor. They'd beaten you at Extremesland. So there'd been a few losses to Flash up to that point. I almost want to sort of characterize this similarly to Vici at the moment against Tyloo, where they keep playing against this team and they keep losing against this team. So mentality-wise, what is that like for a player and for a team? Do you feel like you just can't get over the line? It's like a brick wall that you can just bash your head into and nothing happens?
I've never really felt that until recently, but I'm not sure what's really contributing to it. But I'm not sure about Vici and Tyloo, but when you look at either of the teams play, you would like, when you really think about it, I feel like Vici should win them any day of the week, just in terms of their like understanding of the game and how good those players are. But they just can't seem to get over they just can't seem to win Tyloo. I don't know why.
Don't worry, this is a discussion that I've had many times on a desk and on Geographically Challenged, and it infuriates me to no end that they have that roster and that they somehow like, even when they're by the way, if you remember, they've been in grand finals where they've had the map disadvantage. They've been up 2-0, so essentially 2-1. They're up like 14-12 or something like that. They've broken Tyloo's economy and they still find a way to lose that series. I mean, I don't want to go on like a mad tangent because it's not what this is about, but like it just tilts me to no end that that's the case. Anyways, I don't know what to say.
Yeah. It's just like one of those like the great enigmas of Asian CS. Why can't Vici beat Tyloo? Yeah, it's just one of those things, I guess.
Indeed. One of those things as well that was a great enigma to me was how B.O.O.T never ever performed on LAN, right? So let's talk about another LAN. You go to IEM Sydney 2018, obviously after qualifying for this event. And yep, you've had those 3 slots, so you get through as the dark horse. This time, you've had a little bit of experience at this kind of level, right? You played 1 or 2 tournaments where you first international teams. So are you feeling a little bit better prepared to go up against the likes of, the teams you faced were Mousesports and NRG this time? So How are you feeling coming into IEM Sydney 2018 versus some of those previous international events you went to?
I think we felt a bit more prepared because prior to the event, I think we were given some practice days and we were able to get some practice in against the European teams. So we were able to like maybe adjust to the way that they played. So I would say we were a bit more prepared. And for mouse sports, maybe we watched like a bunch of demos of them, so we were reasonably prepared for them. But I mean, yeah. So
Well, you got
there's always
more
this
rounds this
thing.
time at least.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, yeah, it wasn't anything that we could be too upset about. Like nothing like Dreamhack Malmo. But I think we played Liquid in the first game, right?
No. You
Did
played
we?
mouse sports in your first game. You lost 16-6 there.
I think we played
And
NRG.
then you played NRG and lost 0-2. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Uh, I mean, yeah. I mean, what can I say, man? We just tried our best.
Yeah. All right. Well, the main question I have then is like B.O.O.T an onliner team? Because I think you can look at all of the results that you had in these qualifier events. Even going a bit further, we'll talk about the likes of the Cologne qualifier and what have you, Shanghai qualifier, these sorts of things. And then you go to the event, and I'm not even necessarily talking about just international events, by the way. Like I can understand international events, but even minors and Extremesland tournaments and that kind of thing, you could have been at the time considered some of the best teams in the region, but you never were able to win one of these kind of domestic lands, it feels like. So did you get the sense that B.O.O.T was a bit more of an online kind of a team than a LAN team?
Yeah, I always thought we were an onliner team because when we went to LAN, there was maybe this we always had a slow start when we went to LAN, and I'm not sure why. Maybe it's like a mindset thing, but we always had that problem of having like a very slow start, and we had to like warm up to get into the game, which was not really what we needed to do. But I don't know what's different in online that made us like prepared already from the get go compared to these like actual international games.
It's really weird, isn't it? Because right after IEM Sydney, you come back and you play in the Cologne qualifier, the Asia Qualifier. This is another one of those tournaments where you just look at B.O.O.T and you go, okay, well, they might have a chance of winning, but Tyloo's there, Vici's there. There's a bunch of good teams, even MVP, although they'd made some roster changes by that stage. And you win this tournament, and it's like, how can you do this like once or twice a year, but you can't do it consistently across the board? Because then you went on as well, by the way, to win the IEM Shanghai qualifier, which was a month later. So two tournaments in a row, or even three, really. Like you qualify for IEM Sydney, then you qualify for Cologne, then you qualify for IEM Shanghai. So this is the period that I'm talking about where I actually felt like B.O.O.T was the best team in the region, right? Because you beat Tyloo a couple times, you've outplaced Vici a couple times, you've qualified for all of the tournaments. So this must be the golden period, right, for B.O.O.T? This is the best era that you had as a roster?
Yeah, I think that was like the best string of performances that we had. It's like the best looking one. But I don't know, I felt like our team was so dependent on how well like each of us could show up that day. So if we were hitting our peaks, we would have a really good game and we would probably win. But we didn't have that foundation that let us get across like the finish line even when we are on our off game. So normally so that would mean that if maybe two of us were on our off game, we would probably lose. And I don't know, I think that just draws back to how we weren't practicing correctly. And we were just like very dependent on our firepower instead of our understanding of the game and as a team.
Why do you think that was? Is it like the lack of a strong IGL or just a fundamental understanding of the game was lacking or something like that?
I think it's just a fundamental understanding of the game. I felt that at the time we still didn't have enough people that could. Okay, so my idea of a good team, right, is having just one, like, or like the basis that a team needs is an IGL and maybe another guy controlling another group. So for instance, like you have one guy, we have the IGL calling, okay, let's get like on Mirage or something. Let's get mid control, right? And maybe 3 guys go there. One of those 3 guys have to be calling the shots also, other than the IGL. I think those 2 roles are really like important if you want to make like a team really work together. Because I've tried it so many times, like as an IGL, if I just call my guys to just go to mid, they don't really take the initiative to like use communication to get control of, okay, like we don't have a guy saying, okay, let's get ladder, I need you to do this, I need you to do this. Yeah, we didn't have that guy back then.
So it almost seems like you think you want to have a macro caller in terms of the IGL who's dictating the overall strategy and the idea of what's happening in the round, and then a micro caller in that smaller group who's dictating exactly how that is going to be taking effect. So like you said with that Mirage example, you might be the IGL and you say you want to take mid control. You send those 3, and then of those 3, there's like almost a mid-round caller that's calling exactly what needs to happen for those 3 players, while the other 2 guys are out on the extremities doing whatever. Once mid control's established, it sort of reverts back to you as the IGL to say, okay, well, we want to split A or we want to split B or whatever. Is that the ideal world for Benkai's rosters?
Yeah, that's exactly what I think my team should have. But back then, I guess we just didn't have that. Like, so if we went mid on Mirage and people just hit their shots, then great, we win the round. But if they don't, then we just like go quiet and we just start losing, unless like yeah, and then it just falls down on the IGL's shoulders to make like some miracle call that just works like magic. So
yeah, and maybe you're good enough as individuals to get over the line against Asian teams, but it's very quickly exploited when you go to international events. And I'm talking, the likes of ESL One Cologne, which you had just qualified for. You went there again, a 9-16 against FaZe, and then a 0-2 this time against Renegades. I don't know, from your perspective, what this is like, but I feel like it probably does weigh on team morale in that, yeah, you can qualify for these events all the time, but every single time you go, you come out basically in last place. Is it something that continues to recur and you think, oh, well, like what the fuck are we doing wrong?
I think yeah, so after a while we did start having like second thoughts about if we were doing the right thing, which we really weren't at the time. Like we didn't know how to practice correctly. So last time basically our practice would just be repeatedly screaming and just running strats and just getting it right, instead of really working on our fundamentals and just improving our understanding of the game in general. It was just like running strats repeatedly, which was really pointless actually, because you're not learning anything from it. You're just learning how to execute. It doesn't really teach you anything. So that's basically the loop that our team was stuck in. And in terms of like losing to these international teams, I guess we always had an excuse for it. I would call them excuses, but yeah, we always like told ourselves that, oh, they are full time and we're just like part time and blah blah blah. But I think if we were good enough, we would be able to take these games closer than we should have. Yeah.
Well, another rough result for you that we'll talk about is the Faceit Asia Minor 2018. So it's weird again, and this is kind of what I'm talking about with B.O.O.T being almost an online team, is like you have all of these sick results, and you have the international experience now, which is, you've got more of it than a lot of the teams in Asia, which theoretically normally means you have a better chance of learning quickly, you come back and you kind of just terrorize everyone. Didn't really happen in the case of B.O.O.T. So I understand the Faceit Asia Minor 2018 had some sort of extenuating circumstances where you got invited like 2 days before the tournament actually started because Signature didn't get their visas. So you like traveled from somewhere to somewhere and all of a sudden you're like there, and then you have a shower and you go to the venue and plays. But I mean, was that like as bad as it sounds from your perspective, or was it actually not that bad? You know.
Maybe back then it was okay because we were generally pretty young guys. So like we had the energy to like do these things. But I think what went on was we were invited maybe 3 or 4 days before the event, and we had to fly down, and we basically reached the hotel. We checked in, we settled everything down, and after taking a shower, we had to go to the venue and play already. So we had like zero, I wouldn't say zero sleep, but we didn't have very good like rest coming into the game. But I think we still tried our best. We still did like decent, I think, with like what we had.
Well, you came 5th to 6th, so I mean, I guess that depends what you consider decent out of an 8-team tournament. But I mean, I think in comparison to the results that you had online, where you were beating Tyloo, you were beating Vici, you know, you were qualifying for these events, 5th, 6th ends up being a little bit disappointing, even if it wasn't like, yeah, we got to beat Renegades and Tyloo, because I think on LAN that is a bit of a far-fetched idea. But even Tainted Minds and SC Absolute outplaced you at that tournament. So from my perspective, it's just another one of those. It's another one of those head scratches where I look at B.O.O.T and I'm like, they should have almost even won that tournament, and then they didn't. But with the context of it being you coming over and not having any rest and whatever, I think then there is a bit more of an understanding. But even still, it's got to be disappointing, right? Like every single time you go to an Asian minor, it's just like, yeah, GG. I don't know. Something's happening. It's always a different team as well, you know? This time it's SC Absolute. Like, where have they come from? Fuck knows. You guys have been the best team or one of the best teams in SEA, and then all of a sudden this Japanese squad starts wrecking everybody? Like, how does that happen, you know?
Yeah, if I'm not wrong, that SC Absolute roster has been around for a while already, but they were never really good until that tournament. Yeah, they just suddenly, like, all of them hit their peaks. And I think they won Renegades, right?
Yeah, they beat Renegades in the game, I think.
On Dust 2?
Something like that. Was it this tournament, or it might have been another tournament? I
think it was that one.
Oh, no, they did. Yeah, they did beat them there, yeah.
Yeah.
16-14 really on Dust 2.
Yeah.
You reckon they just peaked at the right time, and I guess B.O.O.T never did?
Yeah, I think that's what it was.
Okay.
Yeah, I think in hindsight, we just like the B.O.O.T roster was just so mentally weak as like a unit. Yeah, that's what I would call it.
Was that an age thing? Like you still hadn't grown up enough?
I would call it an age thing, but I think I don't think that should be an excuse either, because right now, like in Paper Rex, right, we have Forsaken, and he really has like a really good mentality when it comes to how he wants to take this game. And he's only like 16, man. So I think it's like it's just an issue of, it is an issue of growing up, but it was also an issue of when we wanted to grow up.
Right.
Yeah.
All right. Well, one of the last events that you played before you actually went to the military service was IEM Shanghai 2018. This was, I thought, again, another really good opportunity for B.O.O.T to make something happen, because it's a weaker field of teams. It was like the player break, and a lot of teams didn't want to travel to China. So I think the best team there at the time might have been like NRG or like VP or something, from memory. And it was NRG that ended up winning. There was like Gambit and Virtus Pro and Hellraisers. So there's like a few pretty good teams, but they're not like teams that like theoretically are just going to fuck you every day of the week, basically. So you have a chance, but you come into this tournament, and I always feel like it's the same kind of a story for Greyhound. I tell, you know, they came into this tournament expecting to like almost win the thing, and then they came last place. Well, you guys didn't at least come last place. Came 5th and 6th. So there is that. But it just, again, it's like this was another chance that B.O.O.T had that slipped through your fingers.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think we were that prepared, because if I'm not wrong, we had to play with a sub because Winter couldn't get his visa to China.
Yep, you had
so we had to get yeah, we had to get Bulbasaur in. So, but I mean, in his defense, he actually played pretty well for the time that he was given. Like he did pretty well against, I think it was Gambit on Train. So I guess yeah. We should have. It was always a case of we should have done better, right, with this roster, but we just somehow didn't, and that's become like a recurring thing.
It definitely has. I mean, I feel like it's the same thing. We just keep talking about it. It's just like replace X event with Y event, and it's that must have been a disappointing result because you were doing so good, and then you didn't do so good anymore. But the other reason that I bring up this tournament is I kind of feel like this was the straw that broke the camel's back for the roster, right? It's been almost a whole year where you've had like almosts, if that makes sense. You obviously went to go to the military service very, very shortly afterwards, but I felt like this particular event is where the results really started to go downhill. You missed out on like the likes of ESL Pro League Season 8, Extremesland 2018, PLG Grand Slam, because you were out of the roster at that point in time. But none of those results were very good. And in fact, they were even worse than the ones that we were talking about. So let's talk about how you went into the military service and, you know, how that all sort of panned out, because it's finally caught up, right? It's finally caught up with you. We've been talking about it for the better part of now an hour and a half of you continually saying I had to deny opportunities because I was eventually going to have to go into the military. Now you are going into the military. What does that mean for your career at the time? Was it a case of I'm just going to stop playing Counter-Strike for 2 years? Because that's what it seems like from the outside, right? You leave the roster more or less. Like, I think you're probably still on the roster, but the implication is that you are not part of the core anymore. And it always seemed to me that you had tried to stay in the core when you could, but now that you're out of the core, maybe you're taking your Counter-Strike career as a backseat versus the rest of what's happening in your life.
Yeah. When I went into military, I was already mentally prepared to just not play for 2 years, because you could get like it was really dependent on what kind of job I would get in the military. So fortunately for me, I got one that allowed me to like go home every day. It was like a 8 to 5 job. So I could still kind of play part time, I guess, but not really. I would say it's like the same as schooling actually, because it's roughly the same hours. So I was fortunate enough to have that. So after like the basic military training, right, that takes about 2 months. After that, I would go into my actual vocation. So when my vocation started was when I said, hey, I can come back to play part time if you guys want. And they just said, yeah, okay, just come back if you feel like you're ready to do it. And yeah, I just came back to play part time. Yeah, because I couldn't do anything. Like I tried it for maybe after the 2 months in the basic training, I tried it for like 1 month where I just like didn't play. Like I would just come home, and it was honestly so boring for me. So I just decided to come back and play part time as a way to just like speed up the time, you know.